What ho! Hi there, Speedy readers. Nice to see you again, and I assume that as you're here, you've joined me for another exciting episode in the Tales of Northern Lights by Phillip Pullman. And so, I've got the page marked up. Stopwatch is ready for 15 minutes. And what happened last time was the Master was wondering whether she might like to go and hang out with Mrs Coulter, which we're going to see what Lyra's answer is. Okay, so here we go. 15 minutes of fab. I was going to say reading, but writing. Let's say that for sure. I'll leave the reading up to you. But anyway, here we go. She is by way of being acquainted with Lord Asriel. Your uncle, of course, is very concerned with your welfare, and when Mrs Coulter heard about you, she offered at once to help. There is no Mr Coulter, by the way. She is a widow. Her husband died very sadly in an accident some years ago, so you might bear that in mind before you ask. Lyra nodded eagerly and said, "She's really going to look after me." I'm sorry, this isn't a good start, is it? She's really going to look after me. Would you like that? Yes. She could hardly sit still. The Master smiled. He smiled so rarely that he was out of practice, and anyone watching, Lyra wasn't in any state to notice, would have said it was a grimace of sadness. Well, we had better ask her in to talk about it, he said. He left the room, and when he came back a minute later with Mrs Coulter, Lyra was on her feet, too excited to sit. Mrs Coulter smiled, and her demon bared his white teeth in a grin of imp-like pleasure. As she passed her on the way to the armchair, Mrs Coulter touched Lyra's hair briefly, and Lyra felt a current of warmth flow into her. She blushed. When the Master had poured some Brantwood for her, Mrs Coulter said, "So, Lyra, I'm to have an assistant, am I?" "Yes," said Lyra simply. She would have said yes to anything. "There's a lot of work I need help with." "I can work, and we might have to travel." "I don't mind. I'd go anywhere." "But it might be dangerous. We might have to go to the north." Lyra was speechless. Then she found her voice. "Soon?" Mrs Coulter laughed and said, "Possibly, but you know you'll have to work very hard. You'll have to learn mathematics and navigation and celestial geography." "Will you teach me?" "Yes, and you'll have to help me by making notes and putting my papers in order." Oh, I felt that tickle coming. Excuse me. "Putting my papers in order and doing various pieces of basic calculation and so on. And because we'll be visiting some important people, we'll have to find you some pretty clothes. There's a lot to learn, Lyra." "I don't mind. I want to learn it all." "I'm sure you will. When you come back to Jordan College, you'll be a famous traveller. Now, we're going to leave very early in the morning, by the dawn Zeppelin, so you'd better run along and go straight to bed. I'll see you at breakfast. Good night." "Good night," said Lyra, and remembering the few manners she had, turned at the door and said, "Good night, Master." He nodded. "Sleep well," he said. "And thanks," Lyra added to Mrs Coulter. She did sleep, finally, though Pan wouldn't settle until she snapped at him, when he became a hedgehog out of pique. It was still dark when someone shook her awake. "Lyra, hush, don't start. Wake up, child." It was Mrs Lonsdale. She was holding a candle, and she bent over and spoke quietly, holding Lyra still with her free hand. "Listen, the Master wants to see you before you join Mrs Coulter for breakfast. Get up quickly and run across to the lodging now. Go into the garden and tap at the French window of the study. You understand?" Fully awake and on fire with puzzlement, Lyra nodded and slipped her bare feet into the shoes Mrs Lonsdale put down for her. "Never mind washing. That'll do later. Go straight down and come straight back. I'll start your packing and have something for you to wear. Hurry now." The dark quadrangle was still full of the chill night air. Overhead the last stars were still visible, but the light from the east was gradually soaking into the sky above the hall. Lyra ran into the library garden and stood for a moment in the immense hush, looking up at the stone pinnacles of the chapel, the pearl-green cupola of the Sheldon building, the white-painted lantern of the library. Now she was going to leave these sights. She wondered how much she'd missed them. Something stirred in the study window, and a glow of light shone out for a moment. She remembered what she had to do and tapped on the glass door. It opened almost at once. "Good girl. Come in quickly. We haven't got long," said the Master, and drew the curtain back across the door as soon as she had entered. He was fully dressed in his usual black. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. Oh dear. This isn't.
I've had dust up my nose all day, and I'm going to blow it out. Excuse me, mute. Ah! Oh dear. Do excuse me, but when you've got a dusty nose, you've got to blow it. And I don't have time. Where were we? Okay, here we go. This is what my master says. Aren't I going after all? Lyra asked. Yes, I can't prevent it, said the master, and Lyra didn't notice at the time what an odd thing that was to say. Lyra, I'm going to give you something, and you must promise to keep it private. Will you swear to that? Yes, Lyra said. He crossed to the desk and took from a drawer a small package wrapped in black velvet. When he unfolded the cloth, Lyra saw something like a large watch or a small clock, a thick disc of brass and crystal. It might have been a compass, or something of the sort. What is it? She said. It's an alethiometer. It's one of only 6 that were ever made. Lyra, I urge you again, keep it private. It would be better if Mrs Coulter didn't know about it. Your uncle. But what does it do? It tells you the truth. As for how to read it, you'll have to learn by yourself. Now, go. It's getting lighter. Hurry back to your room before anyone else sees you. He folded the velvet over the instrument and thrust it into her hands. It was surprisingly heavy. Then he put his own hands on either side of her head and held her gently for a moment. She tried to look up at him and said, What were you going to say about Uncle Asriel? Your uncle presented it to Jordan College some years ago. He might. Before he could finish, there came a soft, urgent knock on the door. She could feel his hands give an involuntary tremor. Quick now, child, he said quietly. The powers of this world are very strong. Men and women are moved by tides much fiercer than you can imagine, and they sweep us all up into the current. Go well, Lyra. Bless you, child. Bless you. Keep your own counsel. Thank you, master, she said dutifully. Clutching the bundle to her breast, she left the study by the garden door, looking back briefly to see the master's demon watching her from the windowsill. The sky was lighter already, and there was a faint fresh stir in the air. What's that you've got? Said Mrs Lonsdale, closing the battered little suitcase with a snap. The master gave it to me. Can't it go in the suitcase? Too late. I'm not opening it now. It'll have to go in your coat pocket. Whatever it is. Hurry on down to the buttery and don't keep them waiting. It was only after she had said goodbye to the few servants who were up, and to Mrs Lonsdale, that she remembered Roger. And then she felt guilty for not having thought of him more than once since meeting Mrs Coulter. But how quickly it had all happened. And now she was on her way to London, sitting next to the window in a zeppelin no less, with Pan's sharp little ermine paws digging into her thigh, while his front paws rested against the glass as he gazed through. On Lyra's other side, Mrs Coulter sat working through some papers, but she soon put them away and talked. Such brilliant talk. Lyra was intoxicated, not about the north this time, but about London and the restaurants and ballrooms, the soirees at embassies or ministries, the intrigues between Whitehall and Westminster. Lyra was almost more fascinated by this than by the changing landscape below the airship. What Mrs Coulter was saying seemed to be accompanied by a scent of grown-upness, something disturbing but enticing at the same time. It was the smell of glamour. The landing in Faulks Gardens, the boat ride across the wide brown river, the grand mansion block on the embankment where a stout commissionaire, where a stout commissionaire, which was a sort of porter with medals, saluted Mrs Coulter and winked at Lyra, who sized him up expressionlessly. Mouthful. I've got to blow my nose again. Do excuse me. Talk among yourselves. And then the flat. Lyra could only gasp. She had seen a great deal of beauty in her short life, but it was Jordan College beauty, Oxford beauty, grand and stony and masculine. In Jordan College, much was magnificent, but nothing was pretty. In Mrs Coulter's flat, everything was pretty. It was full of light, for the wide windows faced south, and the walls were covered in a delicate gold and white stripped wallpaper.
Charming pictures in gilt frames, an antique-looking glass, fanciful sconces bearing amber lamps with frilled shades, and frills on the cushions too, and flowery valances over the curtain rail, and a soft green leaf patterned carpet underfoot, and every surface was covered, it seemed, to Lyra's innocent eye, with pretty little china boxes and shepherdesses and harlequins of porcelain. Mrs. Coulter smiled at her admiration. "Yes, Lyra," she said. "There's such a lot to show you. Take your coat off and I'll take you to the bathroom. You can have a wash and then we'll have some lunch and go shopping." The bathroom was another wonder. Lyra was used to washing with hard yellow soap in a chip basin, where the water that struggled out of the taps was warm at best, and often flecked with rust. But here the water was hot, the soap rose pink and fragrant, the towels thick and cloudy soft. And around the edge of the tinted mirror there were little pink lights, so that when Lyra looked into it, she saw a softly illuminated figure quite unlike the Lyra that she knew. Pan, who was imitating the form of Mrs. Coulter's demon, crouched on the edge of the basin, making faces at her. She pushed him into the soapy water and suddenly remembered the alethiometer in her coat pocket. She'd left the coat on a chair in the other room. She'd promised the master to keep it secret from Mrs. Coulter. Oh, and this was confusing. Mrs. Coulter was so kind and wise, whereas Lyra had actually seen the master trying to poison Uncle Asriel. Which of them did she owe most obedience to? She rubbed herself dry hastily and hurried back to the sitting room, where her coat still lay untouched, of course. "Ready?" said Mrs. Coulter. "I thought we'd go to the Royal Arctic Institute for lunch. I'm one of the very few female members, so I might as well use the privileges I have." 20 minutes' walk took them to a grand stone-fronted building, where they sat in a wide dining room with snowy cloths of bright silver on the tables, and ate calves' liver and bacon. Calves' liver is all right. Calves' liver is all right, Mrs. Coulter told her, and so is seal liver, but if you're stuck for food in the Arctic, you mustn't eat bear liver. That's full of a poison that'll kill you in minutes. As they ate, Mrs. Coulter pointed out some of the members at the other tables. "Do you see the elderly gentleman with the red tie? That's Colonel Carbon. He made the first balloon flight over the North Pole. And the tall man by the window who's just got up is Dr. Broken Arrow. Is he a Skraeling? Yes. He was the man who mapped the ocean currents in the Great Northern Ocean." Lyra looked at them all, these great men, with curiosity and awe. They were scholars, no doubt about that, but they were explorers too. Dr. Broken Arrow would know about bear livers. She doubted whether the librarian of Jordan would. After lunch, Mrs. Coulter showed her some of the precious Arctic relics in the Institute library. The harpoons which, with the great whale Grimseder, had been killed. The stone carved with an inscription in an unknown language, which was found in the hand of the explorer Lord Ruck, frozen to death in his lonely tent. A fire striker used by Captain Hudson on his famous voyage to Van Tieren's land. She told the story of each one, and Lyra felt her heart stir with admiration of these great, brave, distant heroes. And then they went shopping. Everything on this extraordinary day was a new experience for Lyra, but shopping was the most dizzying. To go into a vast building full of beautiful clothes, where people let you try them on, where you looked at yourself in mirrors, and the clothes were so pretty. Lyra's clothes had come to her through Mrs. Lonsdale, and a lot of them had been handed down and much mended. She had seldom had anything new, and when she had, it had been picked for wear and not for looks. And she had never chosen anything for herself. And now, to find Mrs. Coulter suggesting this and praising that, and paying for it all and more. By the time they finished, Lyra was flushed and bright-eyed with tiredness. Mrs. Coulter ordered most of the clothes packed up and delivered, and took one or two things with her when she and Lyra walked back to the flat. Then a bath, with thick scented foam. Mrs. Coulter came into the bathroom to wash Lyra's hair, and she didn't rub and scrape like Mrs. Lonsdale either. She was gentle. Pan watched with his powerful curiosity until Mrs. Coulter looked at him, and he knew what she meant and turned away, averting his eyes modestly from these feminine mysteries, as the golden monkey was doing. He had never had to look away from Lyra before. Then, after the bath, a warm drink with milk and herbs, and a new flannel nightdress with printed flowers, and a scalloped hem, and sheepskin slippers dyed soft blue, and then bed. So soft, this bed. So gentle, the ambaric light on the bedside table, and the bedroom so cosy, with little cupboards and a dressing table, and a chest of drawers where her new clothes would go, and a carpet from one wall to the other, and pretty curtains covered in stars and moons and planets. Lyra lay stiffly, too tired to sleep, too enchanted to question. Thank you, Lisa. And just to finish that off, it's all going on. Lyra lay stiffly, too tired to sleep, too enchanted to question anything. Dun, 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 dot, dot, dot. So there we are, made it all the way to page 79. And Lyra is, well, she's hanging out with Mrs Coulter, ended up in London, and is having her little mind blown. So we'll find out what happens next time. Until then, you go easy, and I'll see you soon for another Speedy read. All right.
Stand up and fight, for you know we are right. We must strike at the lies that will spread like disease to our minds. Soon we'll have